Hey, everybody out there. Welcome to another episode of Everything Combat because, yes, life is a fight. I am here with my co host, Jeffrey Wilson, the brains behind the operation. And we've got a very exciting guest, well, a very honored guest, Jeff, tonight.
Well, without a doubt, International Boxing Hall of Fame analyst. The man's voice has kind of been the soundtrack to my fight life. Or, watching fights is absolutely incredible, from Top Rank Boxing to commentating with you over on Showtime, and singing a couple ditties every once in a while too, which we're going to get into.
He's done all kinds of stuff. Al Bernstein is joining us. Al, thank you for coming on, buddy.
I am delighted to be with you guys. This is a lot of fun. Thanks for asking me.
And something that I noticed about life for you, one of the jobs that you've had in the past, was you were a newspaper editor in the 70s, and my manager, who was really just a boxing guy also, and ended up being the most prolific, at least the busiest promoter in MMA, Monty Cox, was also a newspaper editor. So you guys have that in common.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, a lot of times it is so. I bump into a lot of people who began that way or have that in their background somewhere along the line and then branch out. And it's true, especially for people. Certainly people in PR or people, like you say, even promoters and other people that you might meet in, whether it's boxing or MMA. It's kind of common.
So is that what you went to college for originally? Was that type of media or media in general?
Well, here's the interesting thing. Yeah, I really wanted to be a sports journalist. I wanted to either write or do broadcast work, and I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle, and they didn't have a journalism school, but I worked on the student newspaper there, and the strange thing is, when I got out of school, I started in working in community newspapers, and kept working my way up until I was managing editor of this chain of community newspapers at a pretty young age. I was only about 29 years old, so it was kind of weird. But all I really wanted to do was sports, but I kept getting pushed more and more into hard news. And finally, I kept freelancing in sports, writing for different newspapers, covering football and other things, and also boxing, obviously, for Ring Magazine and other places, and I wrote a book on boxing. And so I was doing everything I could to get into sports, but the journalistic world kept dragging me farther and farther into hard news. And finally, I quit my job at the newspaper, and that was when I managed to latch on it when ESPN was coming into Chicago as one of the stops of their Top Rank Boxing series back in 1980. That's when I hooked on there.
Yeah. So how did you land that first gig? Did you know somebody at ESPN, or was it just by happenstance? How'd that work out?
No, here's how I did it. I'd written the book on boxing, and I was writing for Ring Magazine. In Chicago, I got in touch with them, and I knew the Chicago fighters, and I said, look, I'll just help you guys. And I didn't ask them for any money or anything, and I helped on the broadcast. They interviewed me on one show, as an author, and I gave them information about the fighters, and I provided them with information about the promotion in Chicago and everything. I just basically helped them. And then they're doing a broadcast, and Tommy Hearns was doing a show with Sam Rosen, and Tommy was struggling a bit, and I was there, and they said, why don't you sit in? And I did, and they liked what they heard. And
Jamie Alatande versus Mike Bradley was that very first broadcast for you, sir.
Good. Wow. Okay, that's doing your research.
Hey, I'm diligent, sir. I'm diligent.
Nobody knows. Nobody would know that. Yeah, Jamie Alatande and Bradley. And that was the very first fight I ever called. And then they liked what I did, and then they started sending me. They kind of divided the country. This is back in 1980, so they were conscious of airplane flights and everything. They had just started very embryonic stages. And so they sent me to everything that was west of the Mississippi. So that was Chicago and Las Vegas for the most part. And then they had Randy Gordon, who was then doing the shows, who would do the East Coast shows. And eventually Randy left, and I ended up doing all the shows.
As being somebody, obviously you're into a bunch of sports. Is there any sport in particular that obviously you're good at all of them, but any in particular that you have an affinity for? And as a fan of boxing, who were some of your old school boxing heads that you kind of watched coming up?
Yeah, The great Don Dunphy, of course, who as a kid I watched him, and he did boxing alone. He never had a color commentator, and he was great. And I later, by the way, he got to be a mentor and a friend to me. In 1986, we were moving the fights to Friday nights, and somebody came up with the idea of interviewing Don Dunphy, and I was thrilled because I'd never met him, and I was only been broadcasting for about 6 years, and I got to interview him, and it was like a wonderful dream come true. Well, he turned out to be a lovely, lovely man, and he became my friend and my mentor. And ironically, his son Bob Dunphy directs our Showtime shows, and of course Pat knows him.
That's great. Wow.
So it all came full circle. But Don was a mentor and somebody I looked up to. And the other, for doing color, that even though he does it differently than me because he's coming from a different place, another mentor to me was the great Gil Clancy, who was just a wonderful man and a fantastic boxing color commentator. He and Tim Ryan were a great team together.
It's amazing you talk about working with Dunphy and that feeling. And I've said this before, and I've said this, while I've done shows with you or just talking to you in person when we were working at CBS Showtime a little bit together. I was David Dinkins, the executive producer over there. I was used to doing shows with Mauro Ranallo, of course, and he said Mauro wasn't going to make it, and that Al Bernstein was going to replace him last minute. And I went, who? He goes, Al Bernstein. I went, wait a minute, I'm working with Al Bernstein? He goes, yeah, you're working with Al Bernstein. I went, oh my God, this is going to be awesome. But I was because I didn't know what kind of person. I go, he's a Hall of Fame broadcaster. What kind of ego does this guy have? I was terrified, but turned out you were the most down to earth person right away, man. It was awesome.
Well, that was let me tell you something. That was a wonderful experience. I enjoyed doing that a lot. I ended up filling in for Mauro a couple of times. One time with Stephen Quadros, and then one time with you and Stephen. And it was a lovely experience. And I said at the time to you, and I've said it many times since, there is nobody that does their sport any better than you as an analyst. And one of the ways you can know that is by working with somebody. And for me, obviously, doing a sport that I'm not an expert on, you rely very heavily, obviously, on the people that are the analysts, and you're just trying to make sure that you don't get out of your lane, and you take care of the business you're supposed to take care of, and don't hinder them in what they're going to do. And it was a wonderful experience.
What were your thoughts on that fight itself? I mean, the spectacle of what that was. What is your categorization of it? Was it kind of a freak show? Is it? I mean, we've seen something like this before. Antonio Inoki, Muhammad Ali. I mean, there has been a precedent set for it. But
are you talking the McGregor-Mayweather fight?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Oh, you mean McGregor-Mayweather? Yeah. No, I was talking about the time I worked with Pat.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When we did MMA together.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Cross the streams there.
Al can do all sports.
Of
Jeff.
course.
Well, I liked doing the MMA, doing play-by-play in the MMA was a lot of fun because I'll get to McGregor and Mayweather in a second, but doing it on the MMA, doing play-by-play with really terrific analysts, Pat, of course, is phenomenal, and Stephen is terrific, was really interesting because it was an interesting challenge to I've done play-by-play in other sports, boxing, of course, basketball, a little football, some other things, and you don't have to be the biggest expert to do play-by-play and do a decent job if you've done your homework and all the rest. But it was a fascinating endeavor to do it. And one of the things that was interesting is, and you guys know this, the MMA community is a little suspicious of people that drop in a parachute and decide they're going to do mixed martial arts,
Poor Gus Johnson.
But yeah, Gus Johnson, yes. And there have been other times where others have been, and so I was very conscious of trying to make sure that audience didn't see me as some kind of, and they were very kind to me. I got very nice comments, so it was good. But the McGregor Mayweather fight was, that was an intriguing match for so many different reasons. As you said, there have been other kind of times when in the different combat sports we've had mixtures. You mentioned the Ali situation, and this one was unique for a bunch of different reasons. Number one, we had two larger-than-life personalities in a promotion to a fight that was unlike any other promotion, honestly, that I've ever seen, because, number one, it was harsher than almost any other lead up to the fight. The language was, a little colorful, I think we could say.
a little bit.
And they weren't going to be able to use any sound bites for PBS, that's for sure. But, it was an interesting, and Pat, of course, and let me say this again, I'll throw another compliment Pat's way. On that broadcast, they made the very wise decision of bringing Pat on and as a voice from the mixed martial arts world, and it was really very, very helpful for everyone, because he knows boxing as well, extremely well, and so he was able to bridge the gap between the two sports, and talk a lot about what how McGregor might be approaching this, and also afterwards to comment on how the fight went. And it was a challenge, I think, for everyone broadcasting it, because you didn't want to treat it like a freak show. You didn't want to oversell McGregor's capabilities as a boxer, and yet you wanted to report it honestly and accurately. And it turned out to be something that was, I thought, entertaining in its own way. And because we didn't treat it like a freak show, I don't know that it came across that way.
Right.
I remember in the van going over to the arena, we all started talking about how long we all thought the fight would go. Right. Do you remember how long you said it would go?
I don't.
I think I said it would end I think it was the 9th I called it. I can't remember. And I don't remember. I think, did it end in the 10th?
Yeah.
I think right in there. So you were pretty close. I thought it was going to go some rounds. I don't remember how long I felt, but I thought there would be rounds. But, at what point, I wasn't sure. And to this day, and I'd be curious to get your opinion, Pat, I'm not sure how much of how long that fight went was because Mayweather decided it was going to go that long.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to...
Yeah. Truly made it last that long. I honestly, to this day, I couldn't tell you what I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, Al.
The thing that was interesting, of course, you were down calling the fight at the time with Morrow and everybody.
Right.
I was upstairs watching the fight. They let me come down ringside. They brought me down for a little bit of the fight, and I sat ringside, which was an amazing experience. But, when I was upstairs, the people upstairs were going, "Oh my goodness, McGregor won the first round. Oh my goodness, McGregor won the second round. Oh my goodness, McGregor won the third round." And I said, "You realize Mayweather lets everybody do that until he figures them out, and then he just puts the clamps down and shuts them down."
That's true. That's a very good point, because boxing, it ends up going the same way in a lot of fights with Mayweather. They'll win early rounds, and then he's figured out the puzzle, and then he starts controlling rounds. And so I think maybe part of it was that McGregor was able to get through enough rounds to make it, and even when Mayweather started, in earnest with his offense, McGregor was still able to hang in there for several rounds until finally it was too much. But it was an interesting event. I'm not, in my opinion, the idea of putting mixed martial artists in with boxers in boxing matches, or putting boxers into mixed martial arts matches with MMA practitioners, in general, I don't think it's something that benefits either sport very much.
Right. It's going to be a unique situation, definitely, and that was a unique situation. And I think it's hard for people who haven't competed to understand that, in either one, there's definitely a fish out of water, and it's very exhausting to switch over to the other one. And I can tell you that, for a long time sparring with really high-level professional boxers, ultimately, a world-class boxer going against a mixed martial artist in a boxing match, the boxer doesn't even really throw punches to exhaust a mixed martial artist because of the inefficiencies in the world of boxing. And McGregor, for as good as he is striking in MMA, is not at that level in boxing, and you could see it clearly.
Yeah, and exactly. And the same is true clearly of boxers when they're attempting to do the different disciplines. You know, one of the cases where a boxer comes over and does well is somebody like Holly Holm, but the reason she did well is she was a kickboxer before boxing and spent, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, almost a full year working with her coaches to be better at avoiding takedowns and jiu-jitsu and all those things, and that was why she was able to make the transition. But it's pretty hard for people to make that transition without that.
Yeah, ultimately she was a martial artist, but she paid her bills with some boxing.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
I know we don't have you for too long, but I have to ask you, and Pat, chime in as well. I mean, the evolution of the sport of boxing. When I came up in like the 80s, you had your Hearns, your Haglers, your, Maurice Blocker, Simon Brown, Roy Jones, Meldrick Taylor, all these different rivalries and great fighters at every weight class. Are they still there? We're just not seeing it anymore because of like the rise of MMA. What's happened to the sport of boxing? Why don't we quite see it as the huge event like it used to be in multiple weight classes?
Well, the 80s were very special. They were it might have been the best decade in the history of boxing. I mean, I've had the old timers that were there before me, and I asked them that, and that was the decade when I really emerged as a broadcaster, and that decade was so special that it's even hard to compare anything to it.
Yeah.
And the early 90s as well. But part of the problem for boxing has been that, and of course now, in the last 7 or 8 or 9 years, boxing's had a nice, in my opinion, it's had a good renaissance, a good resurgence in not only the talent that's available, but the interest from fans. It's now on a number of different platforms, just like mixed martial arts is, and I think both sports now are enhanced by the fact that they're on so many different platforms for the fans to see, and I think good matches have been made in the last 6 or 7 years. The actual product that boxing is putting out there is excellent for the most part. There are matches that don't get made, and that's part of the difference in the two sports, because organizations control, the UFC controls a lot of mixed martial arts along with Bellator and a few other organizations, but it's easier for these organizations to make matches that they want to make. Boxing is like the Wild West. It's like, I always call it laissez-faire capitalism run amok. There are no rules. There's no rules. You can't, everybody, all these different people trying to do things, and it's not under one umbrella. So some matches are going to fall through the cracks. But given that, boxing has put together, very, very good matches during this time. And part of that has been rewarded by the fan base kind of, coming back. And I think I've always been, and Pat knows this, I've always been of the mind that mixed martial arts and boxing are not really competitors. They number one, they each have a certain audience that is its own that may not be into the other sport. And then there's this very large umbrella of people who really like both of them.
Just love combat sports.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. And MMA, in a way, helped boxing because it brought a certain group of people into the combat sports tent that may not have come in through boxing. But then once they were there, I think they paid attention to boxing. And I also think, by the way, the McGregor-Mayweather fight, while I said the mixing of the two isn't necessarily a good thing, that particular event, I actually believe, made a lot of fans of mixed martial arts say, I'm kind of, I'm going to check out the boxing thing.
Well, and I asked that question with all due respect to like your Triple G's, your Vasily Lomachenko's. I mean, I know there's some incredible talent out there, so I appreciate that answer.
Yeah, and speaking of that, what are some of the big matches coming up, Al, that you're going to be calling for Showtime Sports?
Well, we're going to probably in July. They're working on Pacquiao Thurman as a pay-per-view, and we hope that that's going to be that one's going to be finalized. In May 18th, we have Deontay Wilder fighting Dominic Breazeale. And, of course, the heavyweight division has now in boxing has stirred up interest again. We had the great fight with Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury. That was,
that was awesome.
Great theater and great drama. And how in the world did Tyson Fury get up?
Exactly.
Resurrected from the dead.
Yeah, that was incredible.
Yeah, it looked like Lazarus, didn't it? I mean, it was staggering. And so those are coming up. And then the sport has other fights that are percolating. Like Errol Spence may fight Sean Porter. That is a very good possibility. Now, in the heavyweight division also, Alexander Usyk, the cruiserweight champion, who might be the best fighter in the world, even though the cruiserweight division in America doesn't get, a lot of it.
Yeah.
The cruiserweight division has always suffered from that. They have great fights in that division, and he is a superb fighter. He might be one of the best ring technicians in the sport, period. And he's stepping up in weight. You know, if he can handle the big boys with his skill set, he might be an interesting part of that division.
Yeah, I mean, how much weight do you think he cuts, and how big do you think he can get and still move the way he needs to?
That's a very good way to put it. I think that he just made a comment recently in which he said, "I'm not going to bulk up. I'm going to get to a comfortable weight, and I don't want to give up my quickness. I don't want to give up my movement." He said, "I'm going to get a little bigger, but I'm only going to get so much bigger. I'm not going to try and match them in terms of," which I think is a smart idea. And I think he beats most of the D-level heavyweights and on down. Or the question is going to be whether the really big heavyweights are too physically imposing for him. That's the question, and we won't know that until he faces one of them. But I tell you what, I'm a believer in him, and I think it'll be fascinating to see, how well he does at that division.
So you think he can become kind of Tyson or Evander Holyfield 2.0?
Yeah, that's a very good analogy, because Holyfield himself came up for the cruiserweight division in an era when the heavyweights weren't as big. But let's face it, Evander Holyfield had to face Riddick Bowe.
I was going to say, yeah.
They were big, and while he had mixed success against them, he did have some success. Plus, of course, he ended up doing very well against Tyson, but he was a smaller heavyweight. But so, yeah, Evander Holyfield's a perfect example. I was just watching the video of him against George Foreman, which was a fantastic fight. Now, George was older, but George was good, and he was a big man. And, of course, while he lost to Lennox Lewis and had the questionable draw, he did beat Riddick Bowe in one of their 3 fights. And so a heavyweight of that size, if they fight correctly, can beat a bigger man. And I think Usyk is going to give those guys some trouble.
Michael Moore is another one coming up to the cruiserweights to.
Michael Moore, perfect example as well.
Yeah, we had Big George on, I don't know, a couple months back, and I told him that I asked Michael Moore. I hung out with him in Miami one time after that title fight, and I asked Michael Moore how hard George Foreman hit, and he goes, "You have no clue how hard a human being can punch until you get hit by Big George."
Yeah, no, George Foreman, you can make the case one of the 2 or 3 most powerful heavyweights that ever punched, and and he an extraordinary man. George is.
Oh, he's awesome.
George wrote the foreword for my book, and we've been friends for many, many years. And he's just a delightful guy.
Well, I know we don't have you too much longer. If you don't mind, give me with the boxing mind you have, your Mount Rushmore of boxers, maybe +1. We'll give you +1.
Okay, yeah. Well, Sugar Ray Robinson is there for sure. I believe he's the greatest fighter probably who ever lived. He would certainly be up there. Ali would be up there. You have to put Ali there. I would probably, this is going to be cheating, but I would put an amalgam. If I could put 3 guys there and they could be together, they would be Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, and Tommy Hearns.
Oh, wow.
Because the 3 of them mean so much to the sport of boxing, and they're all 3 phenomenal fighters who had fights among each other that were, amazingly thrilling. And so they'd be up there, and Archie Moore would be up there, who won a light heavyweight title won a light heavyweight title at the age of 40 and held on to it for 7 years.
Wow.
That's insane, isn't it?
Fighting very good light heavyweights. So, that's extraordinary. So those would be some of the guys. I'm sure I could, I'd probably miss 20 that
Sure. I got you. Yeah, Sugar Ray's at the top of my list as well. Just an incredible fighter.
The heavyweights would all be Mount Rushmore, and then you could do a mini Rushmore of Hagler, Hearns,
Yeah.
That's right. Well, there's a couple of different mountain cliffs that we could chisel.
Right.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about your music. You still sing in casinos and do some acts and things and get on stage?
I started doing it back in the 1980s, the late 80s, before some of the big fights. It's oddly, at ESPN, I wasn't getting the opportunity to do other sports like I wanted to. Every once in a while, I would get to do play-by-play in a college basketball game, or I would cover events for Sports Center, the NBA, or some other things. But they just were not willing to give me other sports. And I wanted to do other things. I am a pretty eclectic guy, and I have a lot of interests. And so I was sitting around one day, and I said, well, let's see, I can't do other sports, so what's the next logical thing I should do? Oh, I know, I should be a nightclub singer. I mean, that's the next logical step, right?
Of course.
So, and I'd done music in Chicago and everything, and the way it started was the president of Caesar's Palace. I was having dinner with him and a couple of people, and about 3 months before then, Barry McGuigan, who was a great featherweight fighter, had fought at Caesar's Palace, and his father, who was an Irish tenor and used to perform in all the pubs in England, did a 3-night engagement in the Olympic Lounge at Caesar's Palace before the fight, and it was, everybody got a lot of attention, and a lot of people came. And the president of Caesar's Palace said to me, he said, "Don't you do music?" Because I'd sat in with a lot of people at that point out in Vegas. And I said, "Yeah, I love it." He said, "Okay, you have to do 3 nights like Barry McGuigan's dad did." And I said, "Oh, okay." Of course I said yes. And he wanted me to do it the weekend before the Hagler-Leonard fight. And I said yes. I didn't have an act. I didn't have a band. I had nothing. So I had about 4 months to figure out how I was going to pull this off. And I got with entertainment people I knew, and I did it, and it was well received. And then I did it a bunch of times before big fights in the 80s and early 90s at Caesars and a bunch of other places. And then it kind of morphed into a thing I called the sports party, where I would do some sports music, special material, and then we do trivia and video. And because I couldn't really, it was hard to keep a band working, so I kind of did an amorphous version of it. And then I got away from it. And then about, I'm going to say 3 or 4 years ago, I just said, you know what, it's a missing element in my life. In fact, this will be odd. I've always been a horseman. I've had a horse. I've ridden horses for my whole adult life. And I had to put my horse down, and I didn't get another one, and I was missing that experience. And I had nothing in my life that felt completely joyous for me. We all have that in our life, right? We all have things that we say to ourselves, boy, that gives me joy, and I'm glad I can do it amidst all the hard work that we all do, running around and doing what we do. And I said, you know what? I'm going to do music again. And I got back into it, and so now in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been doing a lot of performing at the Tuscany Hotel and Casino, Italian American Club here, a bunch of other casinos.
Nice.
In fact, I've got a show coming up on May 25th that I'm going to do at the Tuscany.
Wow.
Now, would you say that's your passion?
I would. That and horse riding are the 2 things in life that, for me, it used to be playing basketball back in the day when I could do it, but those 2 things are passions for me. They're things that just, are so much fun, and I love music. And my wife, of course, was a performer for 35 years, and my son Wes is a singer-songwriter. So everybody in this, I'm actually the I'm actually the third best singer in my house, which is sad. And here's the sad thing, guys. I'm a distant third, but nonetheless, I persevere.
Too modest. Too modest.
There you go, buddy.
But
Jeff?
it's fun. I really enjoy doing it, and people get a kick out of it. You know, fans will come by and they'll just get a kick out of it. And I do some special material, and I always talk about how the music intersected with the sports, you know, different big fights and sports things, and so that kind of ties the two together.
Well, I have to tell you, sir, I know you said we couldn't keep you too long. This has been an absolute pleasure. This is one of those after I was speaking to George Foreman, I'm like, I'm talking to George Foreman. I mean, here I am talking to Al Bernstein. You've been a huge part of my life, man. You've done excellent work. Keep it up. Continued success and many blessings.
Well, it's a joy to visit with you guys, and anytime I'm happy to do it if it's leading up to a match or anything that you guys want to talk about. And as Pat knows, I'm a big I'm greatly appreciative of the mixed martial arts world, and to the extent that I follow it, which I do, I'm a casual fan, but I'm a fan nonetheless. And I appreciate not only the sport, but I appreciate his great work in it. And you two guys are great on this podcast, so
thank you.
For me, it's a joy. I appreciate you guys getting me on.
Thank you so much, Al. And we really appreciate being able to talk to the legend himself. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of Everything Combat, because yes, life is a fight. Check us out and check out Al Bernstein. If you can see him singing, go see him.
Thanks, guys.